silly. Yeah, very silly.
Dr. Shabir, I wanted to just ask a little question on Allah, because we've had a lot of focus on the Trinity tonight. And Allah, when I read the Quran, comes across to me as a very simplistic God, and a God that would be easy to understand because it's made up from a human mind. That's the conclusion I've had as I've read the Quran. In comparison to the Trinity, that seems to come from a divine mind, because it is complex, and yet it's tangible. So if you could unpack a little bit more about Allah, the monad, the Tawheed, who to me seems very simplistic and therefore man-made.
I want an answer. I want an answer.
Thank you for that question. Contrary to Tawheed being simplistic, it is actually simple and clear. And Tawheed is what comes out not simply from a human mind, but this is the ultimate result of philosophical discussions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas and other Christian scholars worked out arguments for the existence of God, and they always arrive at the belief in one God. Never a trinity, never more than one. He's always the first cause. There's always one who is the first, not a second and a third. It doesn't mean that because the Trinity is complex, this means that it only would have been revealed, and that's why Christians accepted it. I've already shown that historically there were people who would accept even Paul and Barnabas as gods and make their sacrifices to them despite their protests. And that's not the only example in Acts of the Apostles of people just taking somebody to be a god just on a whim. And then the next moment they can discard that god and take another one. So that's how people took people to be gods. When Jesus preached in that environment, there would have been some people who would exaggerate his position, and we can see the exaggeration as we go from Mark to Matthew and Luke and then to John. Even among the Gospels, the same story is rewritten and it becomes something else. What are you to make, for example, of the idea that Jesus lays down his own life according to the Gospel according to John? And he says, "No man takes my life away from me." And he says he will not pray to be saved from the cross. Whereas in the first three Gospels, he does pray. He says, "Let this cup pass away from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." So he does submit to the will of the Father, but he actually obviously has a different will, initially at least. Whereas in the Gospel according to John, he has no different will. He came into the world specifically for this purpose. This is his mission. He knows it from the start, and he's deliberately doing it. Nobody takes his life away from him. He lays it down of his own accord, and then he has been given authority also to take it up again. So it's a different story.
I think if we took if we gave a test to the majority of evangelicals coming out of church this coming Sunday morning on the doctrine of the Trinity, less than half would pass. In fact, I would say we'd have a 75% failure rate.
Yeah.
And probably the majority would test modalistic.
Where is the statement that God is one being in three persons? Well, it's not there.
And I would agree with Tovia that if you approach this question simply on the basis of the Hebrew Bible, or what we would call the Old Testament, one wouldn't come to believe that God is a Trinity. And I would agree with Tovia that if you approach this question simply on the basis of the Hebrew Bible, or what we would call the Old Testament, one wouldn't come to believe that God is a Trinity.
Very silly. Yeah, very silly.
Jonathan just has 30 seconds left. The question was, is the doctrine of Tawheed simplistic? I personally would prefer to go down the route of saying that God is a relational God. God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being, and so the greatest conceivable being must have love as an essential inherent quality. And the God of Islam, Tawheed, cannot be essentially loving because unless you want to say he's dependent upon his creation, who was he loving before creation? So that's basically what I'd say on that.
What the argument's trying to show is that if you suppose that there is a perfect single self, that's impossible. And the line of thinking in popular writings is usually, God is perfectly loving, so therefore he must eternally and independently of creation be engaging in the best kind of love. But then there must be another person within the divine nature for God to love. If God was a single person, then apart from creation, he'd only be able to love himself, and that's not the best kind of love, so God wouldn't be perfectly loving. The problem with these arguments is that I think they have a fallacy at their heart. It's this: God is perfectly loving only if God is perfectly loving. If I paraphrase that, I think you'll see why there's a fallacy there. What they mean is that God has the character trait of being a perfectly loving being only if God is actually loving someone else. But of course, you can have the virtue of being a perfectly loving being and not be actually loving anyone else, because being perfectly loving is a character trait, it's not an action. Imagine that you have a castaway who's abandoned alone on a desert island. Is he an honest guy? Is he disposed such that he will tell the truth to others? He may be an honest guy, but never have a chance to manifest that honesty. Is he compassionate? Is he disposed so as to care about when others are doing poorly? Sure, he might be, but he never actually has a chance to engage in compassionate actions or words while he's a castaway on a lonely desert island. It seems to me these arguments just don't get off the ground at the very first step. Never mind how we get that there are exactly 3 divine persons. I don't see how you get from 1 to 2, because I think you could be perfect in every way and be a single divine person. And yes, you could be perfectly loving as a part of that. And I don't think that you would be lonely or inadequate in any other way. As far as I know, this is where in the whole history of Christianity you see these type of arguments. In Augustine in the early 5th century, Richard of St. Victor in the 12th century, Richard of Oxford in the 20th and 21st centuries, and a few people inspired by him, like William Lane Craig and Stephen T. Davis. That makes this a tiny minority view among serious Trinitarian thinkers. Why is that? I think it's because it's not a convincing argument, but another reason could be this. The argument seems to make the most sense if the persons of the Trinity really are persons, that is, so many selves. Typically, with a person like Davis or Swinburne, the conclusion of this argument is that there are multiple selves in the one God. If you're a one-self Trinitarian, or if you're the type of Trinitarian who doesn't think that we can to any extent understand how the one God is, and so you just refuse to think of selves there, whether 1 or 3, if you're one of those kinds of Trinitarians, you're not going to like these arguments because they have an unwelcome conclusion. Their conclusion is, in your view, a wrong-headed way of understanding the standard Trinitarian language. There are other dubious proofs. Sometimes people will riff on some of Augustine's many analogies. Father's like a soul, the Son's like his mind, the Spirit is his love for himself, things like that. Then people tend to ignore that Augustine thinks that these are all bad analogies. He tries them all out, kind of plays around with them, and then really kind of abandons them. He doesn't think that they're helpful in the end, at least not individually.
We know that the doctrine of the Trinity took a couple of hundred years to develop. Christians got together in the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, and at that time they ruled that Jesus is very God of very God. And they said, we also believe in the Holy Spirit, but they did not say anything about the Holy Spirit being God or that the Holy Spirit should be worshipped. They had to come back in the Council of Constantinople in 381, and that is when they ruled that the Holy Spirit should also be worshipped along with God the Father and the Son. So that shows a development in the doctrine. If you go back even earlier to the Apostles' Creed, which is from the 2nd century, it doesn't even say the Son is to be worshipped. So now we have 3 creeds. The Apostles' Creed, 2nd century. Council of Nicaea, early 4th century. Council of Constantinople, late 4th century. So if you see the development, only one God here. Apostles' Creed, 2nd century. Only the Father is God. Second of these we have in the Council of Nicaea, for early 4th century. Now the Son is also God. Now we have 2. Later in that century, Constantinople, now the Holy Spirit is also God. Now we have 3. So it goes from 1 to 2 to 3. It goes from Unitarian to Binitarian to Trinitarian. And still, I say Trinitarian with some qualification, because the idea that how these 3 can still be one, that this took more time to be worked out. That does not mean that some of the earlier church fathers did not have some inkling of this. Yes, there is development. I've shown that this development started even with the Gospel according to John, and even before the Gospel according to